All right, welcome back to Bible class. We are on lesson 18 of our study through the words of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we are coming up to I would say, the third greatest miracle in the entire scriptures. After the Easter resurrection of Jesus giving us his body and blood in the bread and wine of the Lord's Supper, the raising of Lazarus definitely ranks up there as the next one. And we will see that, especially with the way people respond to it at the end of the lesson this week. So we'll look at the background here real quickly. The opposition to Jesus has grown in Jerusalem. So he moves over to the other side of the Jordan, out in the wilderness area where John had been baptizing before. This is where we find Jesus at the beginning of chapter 11. But then we'll get right into it. The first few words into this chapter, we have Lazarus of Bethany. Bethany and the twin sister of Bethphage were both up just past the Mount of Olives, maybe a couple of miles outside of Jerusalem. So these are suburbs of ancient Jerusalem. So this is where geographically we are. He has left Jerusalem because of the opposition, but he's not gone very far. So let's go ahead and I'll have somebody read verses 1 through 16. First four are just kind of a short paragraph. Let's get really into it. So if I can have somebody read verses 1 through 16. All right, so this is not the only time we see Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. This is a family that Jesus has come to know, has come to cherish and love as friends, which, is starting to bring in the answers to the first question. But this is not the only time we see these. So we have in the first question here to describe Jesus' relationship with the family, using not only what we've just had in the first 16 verses of chapter 11, but then these two passages from Luke 10 and John 12 immediately following what we look at today. So if I can have somebody read the Luke 10 passage. All right, so the Luke 10 passage gives us that he has been welcomed at their home. This is, in ancient culture, the highest form of friendship is being able to sit at table and have that fellowship with one another. This is that whole thing, that he has been welcomed into their house. And here is, yes, the whole Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion. Like any set of siblings, you have one that is the worrier, you have the one that's kind of just laid back, and if there's more kids, you get somewhere in the middle of the extremes there. And we see this. Lazarus is not really mentioned here, other than he's probably sitting at Jesus' feet as well. But now we move on to John chapter 12. Again, this is the next chapter after we get through the raising of Lazarus. So if I could have somebody read that passage from John 12. All right, 6 days before the Passover. This is, as Renee, when she was in the retail world, working for Payless, this was Palm Saturday. This was, for shoe retailers, the largest volume day, because everybody's buying their Easter dresses, everybody's buying shoes to match the Easter dresses. It is a huge day. So this is 6 days before the Passover, which is 6 days before Maundy Thursday, or Good Friday, however you want to do those, because the Passover began Maundy, Thursday evening and was through all of the day on Friday. So we are talking about 6 days before Jesus dies. Where is he? He's in Bethany, at the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. This is the connection he has with them. This is likely the place where he stays most of the times he comes to visit, especially in the latter part of his ministry. Okay, going back into the text a little bit, question 2. Why did Jesus purposely delay going to Bethany? Especially looking at verses 6 and then 11 through 15. Why does he delay on purpose? He didn't want just another healing of a sick person. He wanted to force the hand of the chief priests and the scribes and the elders and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He wanted to force the hand that now was the time for his glorification on the cross. Now was the time. They weren't going to do it because Passover was where Jerusalem quintupled in size and population for that week. They didn't want to mess with all the people around and try to get rid of Jesus that way. And Jesus said, no, this is my time. And he wanted one last miracle to kind of firmly set it in place. And so let's take somebody, not that's sick, and I make well. Let's have him be dead. Not just dead, but dead and buried. Then we'll go. Because we've seen him before raising up the 12-year-old daughter of Jairus off of her bed that she has just died in the last couple of hours. We've seen him raise the widow's son in Nain as he's going out to be buried, which is within 24 hours of death, according to Jewish law. Here, he waits until he is good and dead and buried before bringing him out, because he wants to show truly why he's here. And that is not only to raise Lazarus from the dead, but to raise each and every one of us from our own graves. Which is why, when we get into it in a couple of moments as to the great text that we have at every funeral, going around the Nunc Dimittis, I am the resurrection and the life. He wants to prove that to the people, not just the apostles that are following him, not just to Mary and Martha and Lazarus. He wants to prove it to the opposition that has quelled up against him. All right, so verse 8, we'll get into question 3 here. His disciples object to going to Judea again. What do you think Jesus means by his parable in verses 9 and 10? So take a look at that again, and what is Jesus doing with this? And he's going, look, this is my job. This is what I came to earth to do. I do the work while there is time. So are there 12 hours in a day? And yes, they split up the day, being close enough to the equator that, daylight was roughly 12 hours most of the year. And so, there are 12 hours to work. There's 12 hours to rest and take your sleep. And so, he has it. We are doing this because it is still daylight. It is still the time for him to do the things that he came to do. But the disciples object. What are they afraid of? All right, so they go back to chapter 10. We're in chapter 11 in John. They go back to chapter 10 in John. The Feast of Dedication, where they were there for Hanukkah. Jesus, if you are the Christ, tell us plainly. And when he says, I've told you and you have not believed, they want to stone him. They want to kill him. That's why they don't want to go back. That's what they're afraid of. Because, well, we have it, the understanding ourselves. Guilt by association. You get in trouble just for being in the company of somebody who is in trouble. That's at least the way it was when I grew up. I'm sure it was with you as well. The disciples are worried about that. All right, so as we take over from this fear as Thomas, and we think, okay, we just worry about doubting Thomas, that unless I see the handprints and all of that. It's like, no. Here, verse 16. This is my favorite Thomas quote. Let us also go that we may die with him. It's like, yep, life is over now. It's like, yeah. So you have your cynics, you have your doubters, you have your just kind of, pessimist. Yeah, Jesus did too, and his disciples. All right, let's pick up with the next reading. Somebody read verses 17 to 27, and then somebody else 28 to 37. All right, so here is the big portion of this whole lesson here. The talk about the actual miracle itself. Now, verse 5, or paragraph 5, question 5. What are these things again? Yeah. We talked about a minute ago before we got to reading this, because, I read ahead and got there early. But why does John mention that Lazarus has been dead for 4 days? To make sure everybody knows he's dead. Like I said, burial is supposed to take place within 24 hours of death. So now this is another 3 days after that. There is the idea that the soul left the body to go into the place of paradise or the place of judgment, wherever its eternal destiny was after 3 days. So this is definitely, he is dead. No questions there. All right, question 6. Again, we talked about this. Where is Bethany? How does that explain the disciples' concerns? What are they afraid of? They're afraid of the Jews in Jerusalem, the leaders in Jerusalem wanting to kill them. Bethany is 2 miles away from Jerusalem. I mean, that's not far. I mean, that's an easy day's walk for somebody who really wants to get there. It's not. It's really, really close. It's not there, but it's really, really close. All right, so Martha's statement in verse 21. What does that imply? How might she have felt since Jesus did not come when they sent for him? So verse 21, we'll go back to it again. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. How does that fit with Martha? How does that bring in the idea of Jesus delaying? Well, Martha believed that Jesus could heal Lazarus. That wasn't an issue. So they sent for him to say, your friend Lazarus is sick. And Jesus says, okay, Lazarus is sick. All right, well, we'll go on with what we're doing. How might she have felt? Well, like we think a lot of times when God doesn't quite answer our prayers in a clear way, or we just get a decided wait in there. Is God busy? Does he care? I mean, he's healed other people. Why not this man who is a good friend of his, who's my brother? I mean, the questions abound because Jesus is like always there in the major times of the year. And the one time they need him, he doesn't show up on time. Well, again, Jesus shows up exactly when he wants to show up. So move on to the rest of Mary's statement in verse 22. What do you think she means when she says, "But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you"? What does she mean by that? Well, Martha believed that Jesus really could do anything. I mean, she really believed that if he asked God for this, God would do this. That there was nothing that Jesus would ask that God the Father would not do. So she has great faith. Or it's just that wishful hope. Yeah, okay, it's too late, but can you still at least try? I mean, you got both sides that you could take that. Either firm faith that, okay, he's been dead 4 days, but God will still answer you. Or, he's been dead 4 days. It's kind of pointless, but, Lord, if you ask, I'm sure God will do something. And so, you have both sides there that can be in that statement right there. All right, question 9. What else do you learn about Martha from her conversation with Jesus in verses 21 to 27? So starting off with the Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, all the way through, I am the resurrection and the life, and her saying, yes, I believe this. And what do we find out? How does Martha's conversation with Jesus sometimes even equate to your prayer life with Jesus? She is a woman of profound faith and love for Jesus. She would not have allowed him in her home so often had she not had a profound connection with him. And yes, she's hurting. Her brother has died. Like most women of her time, we have no indication that she or Mary are married. Since it's the house of Mary, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, Lazarus would be the main breadwinner in the family. Now that's gone. Would they end up going destitute? Is there going to be issues that come up? All the what ifs that come with a terminal diagnosis, the death of a loved one, or the near miss of death of a loved one, that somebody got close. We have these what ifs. The questions are there because we're human. We don't understand how all this is going to be. We don't understand why God would allow certain things to happen. And yet, we cling to the faith that we have in Christ. All right, so we're getting into a couple of other passages here on the idea of resurrection. So what teaching on the resurrection might she have known? So if I can have somebody turn to Daniel chapter 12 and somebody else to John chapter 5. All right, so Daniel chapter 12. This is actually the part of the Old Testament reading for next Sunday as we celebrate the feast of St. Michael and all angels, as we read from chapters 10 and chapter 12 of Daniel. And so it says, at that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble. Very much like what Revelation says. But, and then we go back to verse 2. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So here, and in Hebrew especially, there's not a word for all. There's not a word that covers everything. So you get to many. And if they really want to stress it, you get to very many or a great many. That wants to talk about everything. So everyone rises, some to glory and everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. So we have this idea from Daniel that there is a resurrection at the end of time. That when everything else goes and the Messiah comes back, we have that resurrection of all who have fallen asleep in the dust of the ground. So we have that one there. Now, John chapter 5. Should have marked this one beforehand. All right, beginning at verse 28. Jesus himself is saying, don't marvel at this idea that there is a resurrection from the dead, that there is something happening where the dead will hear the voice of the Lord, going back to verse 25. This is in the scriptures. He would go on to say elsewhere that improving the resurrection to the Sadducees who did not believe in a resurrection of the dead, that Moses talks about it in the burning bush. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Present tense, right now. Even though Jacob's been dead for over 400 years. And Isaac, probably 40, 50 years before that. Abraham, before that. So we're talking present tense right now. I am the God of guys who died 500 years ago. It's right there in the scriptures, if you can see it. So then we move to question 11, verses 25 and 26, back in our reading here. How does Jesus' claim in these verses stretch Martha's faith? Sure, she understands that, yes, on the last day, Lazarus will rise with everybody else. I mean, okay, she gets that from Daniel, maybe from hearing Jesus talk about it before, from Moses, all of these things. It's in the scriptures about the resurrection at the end. But Jesus points to, again, present tense, I am the resurrection and the life. I am the one that brings about the resurrection. And so, if I want to do it now, I'll do it now. Which we see in a few verses that he actually does. We'll get that in a few questions. So again, we see Martha's powerful statement in verse 27. After being asked, do you believe this? She says, yes, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. How is this statement from her a powerful example for us? She firmly believes in Jesus. I mean, she is a true believer in Christ. She has seen some of the things he has done. She has heard him teach, over the, rattle of pots and pans in the kitchen. She has heard him teach Mary, Lazarus, herself, her neighbors, her family, other family and friends, that she knows what this is. She knows who this is. So that's the example that she gives to us. That Lazarus' death didn't bring any doubts to her. It didn't shatter her faith. She had faith still in Christ. All right, so question 13 gets broken up into a couple of parts here, because now we get Mary involved. When Mary came to Jesus, she repeated the same statement as Martha. Mary saying it in verse 32, Martha saying it in verse 21. Lord, if you would have been here. If you would have. Okay, great. The two sisters had probably said this to themselves repeatedly and to each other. If Jesus had just been here, Lazarus would still be here. How might Mary repeating this statement to Jesus contributed to Jesus' weeping and emotional response, even though he knew he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead? How does this work? Well, it's showing that Jesus is fully human. Just like you and me, he has his moments where he is brought about by charged emotions to bring himself to tears. Even though, yes, he knows what he's going to do in 30 seconds. But it's the heartache of both sisters that, yes, he weeps. And so part B, how can this account of Jesus weeping help you trust him more? Now, I've joked with confirmation kids for close to 20 years now that, there are some of them I might want to, make their confirmation verse, Jesus wept. One, so they memorize it easier. Two, just say, is Jesus weeping over your confirmation? Okay, kind of a joke there. But, how does Jesus' weeping help you to trust him more? Jesus is weeping because he has compassion. He has compassion on Mary and Martha. He has compassion on you and me as well. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sitting here as baptized Christians. Because if he didn't have compassion on us, we'd have nothing in the Gospels. We'd have the Old Testament and a bunch of moral codes to try to keep up with, to try to show that we're better than somebody else, or just show that we're abject failures in what we're supposed to be doing because we can't keep up with all this. But he comes to give us peace, mercy, and grace in our salvation. So those looking on, the mourners who are there, even 3 days after the funeral, they're still there. And so they react to Jesus weeping in verse 34, in verses 36 and 37. Why are they commenting like they do? They're repeating the same thing of Mary and Martha. If he would have been here, see how much he loved him. If he were here, he could have healed him. If he were here. Well, as we get into verse 38, in the next reading, we see, not if he were here. No, he is here now. What is he going to do? All right, so we pick up with verses 38 to 44. If I can have somebody read that. All right, here we have the resurrection of Lazarus. Here we have Jesus proving what he can do, what he wants to do, and what he is going to do at the end of time. So now, this again, one of my favorite portions of this entire miracle. Martha's objection in verse 39. Okay, she was confident in verse 22 about what Jesus could do. But now, verse 39, Jesus says, take away the stone. How does Martha's attitude change? Well, Martha was like, Lord, it's been 4 days. There will be an odor. Or as the King James, which I believe has the better translation here, Lord, I thinketh he stinketh. He's been dead 4 days. It's going to stink when we take the stone away. But again, how does that go? Well, yeah, it's kind of like, all right, yes, you could do anything, but do I want to deal with the consequences that happen? Because, oh yes, okay, if you're going to raise Lazarus from the dead, great. But my nose isn't going to like it for a little while. Well, okay, your nose will get over it. It will. All right, question 16. Here is another one of those statements that, we have to ask this question when we get to verse 41. How do you explain Jesus saying, I thank you that you have heard me? Why does Jesus pray like this? Again, it's not a prayer for him. It's a prayer for us. It's a prayer for the mourners and Mary and Martha and everybody else. It is that moment of, yes, this is how you are to pray. Lord, I thank you for having heard me. Again, we'll hear this again next Sunday from Daniel. A lot of things going on between John 11 and Daniel 12, or 10 and 12. So, come back next week for the service and hear that sermon. I'm sure it'll be a good one. Or at least I'm hoping right now. All right. But first of all, Jesus is giving thanks in advance. We oftentimes have this when we send off emails with requests. We'll put all the verbiage of the request in there, and then at the bottom when we sign it, thanks in advance. But he's giving thanks in advance because he knows what's going to happen. He knows what is about to happen. So he's thanking them, bringing us the notice that we need to thank God, even in advance. We thank God not for what he has already done for us. Yes, we do that. But we thank him for what we've asked for giving us an answer to our prayers, for giving us whatever it is that answer becomes in our lives. And so what are the implications for us, with this idea of being thankful people? So we look at John 15, verses 15 to 17. Jesus says here, in the middle of his sermon on Maundy, Thursday, no longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and appointed that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give it to you. Jesus has appointed his disciples. He has appointed us to ask for what we want, to ask and be confident that we will get an answer. Because as we talked about with the Lord's Prayer, it's not just that we have been given the words to say. We've also been given the promise that God will listen to us. We've also been given that promise that he hears us. All right, very quickly, we're going to go through the end of the chapter. We're making it all the way through all 57 verses. So if I can have somebody read, or a couple of people read, verses 45 to 57. All right, so reactions to Lazarus' resurrection are all over the board. What are some of the different responses to Lazarus being raised from the dead? And why do people react that way? Well, some came to faith because he just raised a man who's been dead for 4 days. Nobody else has ever even thought of that. Any other resurrections throughout the Bible have been in the hours after death. There's never been anybody who has talked about raising somebody on the 4th day. Others refused to believe. Others did not want to, they could not deny that it happened, but they refused to believe. And that just stifled and solidified their anger against him, because they refused to accept him as the Son of God. And the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the chief priests and the elders and the scribes and all those who were in power in the religious establishment in Jerusalem, they were threatened. Therefore, yes, they want to kill him. And they want to kill Lazarus as well, because he is the proof of everything. They need to get rid of both of them. All right, so finally, the last question is just consider these thought questions, whether right now or just consider them through the week. Have you ever experienced a time when it felt like God was not answering your prayers? And how did you deal with that? Can you think of a time when you encountered a challenging situation that ended up stretching you and strengthening your faith? What might have been different for you if you had never experienced that difficulty? If you hadn't gone through that trial? What is your testimony of God's provision in that circumstance? And then, how does your love for Jesus move you to action this week? How does your love for a man who not only can raise a man who is 4 days dead, but will raise all of us from the people who died moments before he returns, all the way back to Abel, the first one to die? Every last one of us, he is going to raise from the dead. That sparks us to love this week. All right, we're going to close up here, closing with the Lord's Prayer. And I pray God's richest blessings on you over this next week.